The Humans Under the Bed, written by Kevin Strange, performed by Kevin Strange, recorded at the Raven's Nest Studio, engineered by Tim O'Sabin, produced and edited by Tim O'Sabin. Dexanthian opened his eye. Had he heard what he thought he heard? Or was it another nightmare? They'd become so frequent, the terrible dreams of home invasion and violence upon his family, that he didn't immediately jump out of bed when he heard his son scream. It wasn't until he heard it again that he leapt from beneath his warm blankets and covered the distance between bedrooms in 3 loping steps. He swung the door open, not letting the panic he felt in his wide chest seep into his voice. He said,
"Dexy? Willix? You kids okay in here?"
His twins, Dex Jr. and his little girl Willix, shared the room. They both had beds situated side by side against the far wall, but inevitably Dexanthian would find Willix curled up next to her brother each morning, snuggled in the crook of his arm. Now her bed was empty, the covers thrown back. Dexanthian took a cautious step into the room.
"Kids?"
Dexy's bed was occupied. A large lump under the covers rose and fell as though breathing.
You guys all right?"
he asked. This time, his anxiousness betrayed him, and his voice squeaked a bit. Another step, and he was beside the bed. Watching the lump, he carefully took hold of the corner of the blanket and held his breath. When he pulled it back, he had to suppress a cry. Under the covers were 2 pint-sized little creatures staring up at him. One was green, with reflective, aqua-colored scales, a huge, unblinking red eye taking up 3/4 of a face, already more than half of the ugly little beast's entire body. It was shaped like a Twinkie, stood on end. One elongated tube with thin, long arms and feet ending in webbed claws. Razor-sharp teeth lined a mouth that ran nearly all the way around the horrific creature's head, and a long blue tongue wagged out from one side, stretching half the length of its whole body. The other thing resembled a grotesque fly if it had been cooked in a microwave and left out in the heat of the sun to spoil. The thing was bluish-gray in color, like what a potato might look like if left out in a dark alley in the winter. Its head was all eyes, 2 big, bulbous things with thousands of facets, all red and wet. 4 antennae sprouted up from the tiny crown of its head, a head not even half the size of its huge eyes. Its body shape was vaguely humanoid, with 3 sets of thin arms and 1 pair of skinny legs, each ending in a lobster-like claw. 2 pairs of transparent, slimy wings jutted up off its back and hung down, draping over its thin, emaciated body like a see-through nightgown. But its skin was the worst part. It was made up of tiny, pinhead-sized versions of itself. Like the itty-bitty things had replicated and multiplied until they had become one larger version of themselves. They were constantly moving, shifting, trading places as they linked together, claw to claw, wing to wing, in tens of thousands of little connections. But Dexanthian didn't have to suppress a cry because there were little monsters in his child's bed. His children were the monsters in Dexy's bed, and he was a monster too. A full-grown version of little Dexy, huge and scaly and just as awful-looking as his son. And Willix was the spitting image of her mother. No, Dexanthian was startled because there was supposed to be a 3rd monster in the room with his kids. Their friend Buxtack, son of Buxtack the Horrible, Buxtack the Titan, the World Eater, the Invincible, the Scourge of the South, and the Defiler of Nations. He was also Dexanthian's best friend, who died in the final battle with the humans. Buxtack Jr. was staying the night, as he did every other weekend, while the children's mothers worked night patrol around the monster city. If something happened to her little Buxy, his 9-headed, serpentine mother would eat Dexanthion for breakfast.
"What's wrong, Dex? Where's Buxtack?"
Little Dexy looked up at his father, sniveling. His gigantic eye was moist. A tear threatened to drop down on his enormous blue tongue. Daddy, Willix was talking about the humans again. The humans under the bed. Dexanthion heard the toilet flush and the steady clomp, clomp, clomp of Buxtack's fat feet stomping down the hallway. The yellow monster, no older than his children, but nearly as tall as the towering Dexanthion himself, awkwardly waddled into the room.
Had to pee,
the hulking monster said, his high-pitched voice betraying his youth. He was round and thick, with 2 sets of stubby, antler-like hands, ending in even stubbier fingers tipped with reptile-like eyeballs, just like his mother's, sticking out of the top of his head that never really ended in a neck, just kept rolling on down his bulbous body. His legs were little more than ankles protruding from the base of his egg-shaped body, ending in 2 enormous feet longer than Dexy and Willix's entire bodies. Buxtack flopped down on the floor next to Dexy's bed where a single pillow lay. He was round and pudgy enough already. He didn't need to sleep in a bed to be comfortable. Dexanthion sighed with relief and sat down on the edge of Dexy's bed, causing the front end to raise up from his hefty bulk. He stroked Dexy on top of his scaly little head. Dexy the fraidy cat, his sister always tormenting him with stories of the humans.
There's no such thing as humans, Dex. Haven't been for a long time.
Dexanthion tried to stay in the calm, soothing voice that always quieted his son's fears. This time, however, the huge monster was not able to control his voice. It warbled when he mentioned the humans. He hadn't personally seen one in over 500 years, not since the Great Purge, when humanity's single most awesome achievement, a self-aware supercomputer, dubbed itself the Overmind and called up mankind's greatest nightmares with its flesh forges, waging an endless, genocidal war on its creators. Dexanthion was born in one of those forges, fought in that war, personally murdered countless thousands of human beings. He was there when the last living person was skinned alive, quartered, and fed to the Overmind itself. But lately, there had been talk, rumors, and murmurs from the night patrols that weird-looking things had been spotted in the hills and mountain ranges just outside the monster city. Horrible creatures that looked like hairless monkeys, warped and fused with steel and wires. Human technology. The kind of technology that hadn't existed since the Overmind grew itself a nightmarish flesh body and covered the entire world with great, creeping madness. The monster city was one grand, cyclopean mound of writhing flesh. Tendrils and clawed things, bat-wing-like drapes of semi-transparent flesh, and doorways laced with fang-filled mouths made up the houses and buildings. Phosphorescent giant eyeballs atop slimy batrachian stalks acted as street lamps, and rivers of bright green slime served as roads, all weaving together into ambulatory mazes of Stygian horror the monsters called home, overseen by the titanic flesh mountain of gibbering, oozing, twitching horror known as the Overmind. Nothing of human civilization remained, and hadn't been seen in half a century.
Yes, huh?
Dexy said, defiantly sitting up in his bed.
Willix said she hears them whispering under her bed at night. Tell him, Will.
The little fly creature next to him blushed. She looked embarrassed. She stammered through her explanation.
I hear things, Daddy. They talk about us when they think we're asleep.
Buxtack gulped and darted his finger eyes around the room as if scanning for humans.
Is that true, sir? Maybe I should sleep on the couch.
Dexanthion sat stunned. His children stared up at him, waiting for an answer, for him to calm their fears and tell them everything would be okay. He stood slowly and sighed.
Maybe,
he said, scratching his scaly chin with a purple talon.
Maybe you're right. Maybe there are humans under your bed.
Dexy began to whine. He clutched Willix, another tear forming in his huge eyeball. Suddenly, Dexanthion shot his arm out and grabbed the foot of the bed, lifting it off the floor, nearly touching the ceiling.
Hello?
He yelled dramatically.
Any humans under there?
He held his free hand up to the hole in the side of his head that served as an ear.
What's that? You're gonna eat my kids when I go to bed? Well, don't do that. They're good kids.
Now all three children were laughing. The lumbering monster dropped the bed, causing his children to pop up in the air before landing back on the mattress of coiled tentacles. He darted across the room and lifted the other bed.
Any humans under here?
Stop it, Dad, Dexy said, his tears now caused by laughter. Dexanthion charged across the room and swung open the closet door.
Is this where all you humans are hiding?
Now the children's laughter filled the room. Even Buxtack was rolling around on the ground pretending to talk to humans under the bed. Dexanthion smiled. He tucked the children back into bed, kissed them each on the heads, and walked out of the room, shutting the door behind him. As he crawled back into his own bed, the unease he'd felt earlier almost seemed silly. He turned off the light and laid in the dark for several minutes before turning the bedside lamp on. He peeked under his own bed just once to make sure. What woke Dexanthion next was not just the screams of his children, it was the screams of his children followed by an explosion that shook the foundation of their flesh home. Baring his gigantic fangs and flexing his foot-long talons, he galloped the short distance to the kid's room on all fours, ready to tear anything harming his offspring to pieces. Putrid black smoke hit him as he crossed the threshold into Dexy and Willix's room. The smell of charred flesh assaulted his nostrils. He hoped to the overmind that it was not the flesh of his children. As the smoke cleared and Dexanthion's eye adjusted to the thick darkness, he saw them. Not his children. There was no sign of the young monsters. Humans. A pair of them. They were nothing like he remembered them, the soft-bodied creatures that he'd once dismembered and eaten in scores had changed in the 500 years since he last laid eyes on them. There were two of them standing in front of the ragged, gaping, bleeding hole that should have been his son's bed. Each one was different, but they shared several unmistakable similarities. Their skin was pale almost to the point of translucency, having never been exposed to the sun. Blue veins coursed through their mangled flesh, and Dexanthion could almost make out the layers of muscle under the skin. Their heads were caged inside a series of steel bars bolted to the tops of their heads and at the bases of their shoulders. Their eyelids were pinned to their foreheads and cheeks, causing their mouths to pull open in hideous grins that were home to jagged metal serving as teeth. Their torsos were naked, revealing more twisted metal modifications. There was some sort of circular contraption bolted to the center of their chests. Thick metal spokes radiated out from the circular thing across their chests onto their upper arms, digging trenches into the flesh, seemingly grafted to the bones of their arms. The spokes continued past a pair of steel elbow joints, down the forearms, ending in foot-long metal claws grafted directly onto the flesh of their hands. Similar modifications crisscrossed their legs and feet. It only took Dexanthion a moment to find out what purpose these modifications served. The circular things on their chests spun, creating a high-pitched hum as it sent gyroscopic energy through their technologically enhanced limbs. This caused their entire bodies to vibrate and shake. Dexanthion was convinced they were about to shake themselves to pieces when they struck. They were faster than any human Dexanthion ever fought during the Purge. Stronger, too, tenfold. The two humans screamed. Their voices warbled from the motion of all the metal fused to their bodies. They lunged at him as several more crawled out from the smoking pit in the middle of little Dex's room. Both humans hit him at the same time, one on each of his tree-trunk-sized arms. They wasted no time, slashing, biting, and tearing at his nearly indestructible scaled hide. To his surprise, they'd already pierced his skin in the few seconds they'd been wailing away at him, a feat no human had ever achieved in hand-to-hand combat in the thousands of battles he'd fought during the Purge. Dexanthion quickly smashed his arms together, squashing the first two humans like bugs. Their shattered and broken limbs hung uselessly in their steel cages, dripping blood and gore as the hulking monster wadded them up and used the whole mess like a baseball bat as the next wave crawled up out of the smoking hole in the floor, warbled their war cry, and charged him. 3 of the metal flesh hybrids ran at him. 2 were females with symbols carved into the sides of their heads, and the other a black-bearded male, huge in his own right. With his modifications, he stood nearly to the top of Dexanthion's chest. The monster swung his corpse bat, making quick work of the first female, giving the second a chance to leap up onto his arm and scuttle onto his back while the male stepped forward, lifting his right arm, which had been fused with some kind of rectangular mace. Using his left arm as a counterbalance, the male human swung his arm weapon at Dexanthion, forcing the monster to parry using his corpse bat. The force of the blow buckled the steel beams and sent most of the wadded-up flesh flying across the room. With his weapon useless, Dexanthion reached back and pawed at the female, who was using some kind of a blowtorch attached to her head cage to burn the top of the monster's head. Having been forged in flame and nightmare, the blowtorch did little damage, aside from giving the huge beast a slight headache. Dexanthion's talon hooked the torch's wiring, and he flung the female off him like a booger. She landed half in, half out of the window in Dexy's room. As she struggled to crawl back into the house, the window's razor-sharp fangs snapped shut, severing the female in half at the waist. She twitched and bled, hanging from the wall, dying slowly. Now, face to face with the bearded human, Dexanthion threw a punch. To his surprise, the big man grabbed it mid-swing. The human swung his mace again, forcing Dexanthion to grab it with his free hand. Now, deadlocked, the two muscled giants pushed and pulled on each other in a virtual stalemate. That is, until Dexanthion's long tongue split in two, revealing a 2-pronged appendage hidden inside. The appendage struck out like a snake, embedding itself into the bearded human's forehead, causing him to instantly go limp. His mouth hung open, and his stretched open eyes glazed over. Dexanthion was inside of his mind. The monster saw everything the big man saw his fears, saw his memories, saw his whole short, violent life. And as another score of vibrating, screaming humans flooded out from the hole in his son's floor like a plague of locusts, Dexanthion saw the plan. The twisted, insane plot that these creatures had formed. The war they would now wage against the Overmind and his monster race. And even as he beat, crushed, and smashed the biomechanical things with ease, he knew. After seeing inside the bearded man's brain, seeing what lay beneath him inside the catacombs underneath the monster city, Dexanthion knew. The humans would win the war. Dexy was blind. The blast had knocked him unconscious. His ears rang so loudly he couldn't hear himself crying. As he regained his wits, he felt an immense pressure on his chest. Finding he could still move his arms, he pushed and the pressure moved. The chaos in his little room came into focus as the pressure, his bed, fell from in front of his face, allowing him to see again. What he saw was at least 10 naked, vibrating, hairless monkeys encased in a shiny material that he'd never seen before, attacking his daddy. Were these humans? The stories Willix had told him about the beings who once inhabited the earth didn't describe the savage things crawling all over Big Dex, as his mommy called his daddy, at all. Willix. Panic set in as the small monster frantically searched through the rubble for his sister. He pulled a jagged piece of flooring away from the top of a pile and saw an arm partially concealed by more debris. Dexy redoubled his efforts, tossing aside the fragmented remains of his bedroom to fully uncover the limp body of his sister. Lifting one last big hunk of bone that served as his floor, Dexy freed his sister from the mound of rubble. "Willix!" he screamed. His voice still sounded far off, but the ringing had begun to subside. Dexy began to hyperventilate. She wasn't moving. "Willix!" he screamed again, this time shaking her arm. The little fly girl stirred, coughing. Relief surged through the small Cyclops monster. What's happening?"
Humans!
Dexy said, almost excited by the invasion. Willix's own eyes bulged. She peeked around the huge pile of rubble separating the little monsters from the battle raging next to their bedroom door. "We have to hide," she said, pulling pieces of bone around them to conceal their location. A huge hand shot out from the side of the rubble. Eyeballs on the tips of the fingers blinked dust away. Buxtack shook himself the rest of the way free. He smiled dumbly at the other two monsters.
Hey!
He said, oblivious to the events transpiring directly behind him.
Don't worry,
Dexy said, smiling back. He pointed at his father.
Daddy will protect us.
Big Dex deflected a blow from a pair of humans with spinning buzzsaws grafted to their chests using the body of the huge bearded man. The saws shot sparks all over the room as they connected with the gyroscope on his chest, causing an awful high-pitched squealing noise. Big Dex's tongue was still embedded into the man's forehead. It stretched across the human's head like a fleshy mohawk before it connected back into Big Dex's mouth another 5 or 6 feet away. The bearded human's mouth still hung slack as Big Dex controlled his limbs, having gained complete control of his nervous system. The monster crushed faces and stomped bodies into mush even as he controlled the burly man's reflexes, causing him to smash the 2 buzzsaw-wielding humans with his mace arm, his other having already been sliced off along with one of his legs. His intestines hung freely from a giant gash in his stomach, and he oozed blood from 6 different mortal wounds across his body. Big Dex figured he could get a few more good kills out of the big man before he'd have to discard him and stab into the mind of another lunatic human. As much fun as he was having felling scores of these savages, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread from the revelations made inside the human's mind. He needed to find his children, and he needed to get them to safety. That's all that mattered. That's when the machine crawled out of the ground. It was actually 5 humans, but they each had machine parts grafted onto their already modified bodies. A pair of them had their left and right arms removed, respectively. In their place were what looked like cannon barrels cut in half down the center. Another pair was missing either leg in much the same fashion, while the 5th had no lower body at all, just a cylindrical piece of technology grafted onto its trunk that resembled the base of a light bulb. The bizarre people began to lock these various pieces into place, while servos spun and lights all across the weird machine blinked on and off. The legless human climbed up the half-formed machine and screwed itself into a round opening at the top, completing the unusual piece of machinery. Big Dex already knew what it was. A weapon. A flesh cannon powerful enough to destroy any monster caught between its crosshairs. The Overmind had created its monsters to eradicate humans. It made them immune to human weaponry. Guns, bullets, rockets, bombs were all useless against the hordes of terror. These humans had developed new technology. Big Dex knew because the bearded man knew. He saw the memories of countless millions of experiments over hundreds of years as the beings dwelling below the monster city turned their very bodies into weapons capable of killing monsters. Big Dex braced himself, grabbing the bearded man around the waist to use as a shield while extracting his tongue from his forehead at the same time. Lights all along the sides of the machine all lit up green, and the human screwed into the top of it began to spin. Smoke wafted up from the man's body as he screamed, spun faster and faster, and then, without warning, melted down into the barrel, skin, bones, and all, leaving the metal exoskeleton to fall, discarded off to the side of the machine. A blast of molten flesh exploded from the barrel. Big Dex ducked behind the bearded man as best he could. The screaming, flailing man, now finally back in control of his own body, but held fast by the monster's huge claw, took almost all of the supercharged blast, turning him into a red smear across the monster's scaly chest. Big Dex howled in pain as he looked down to find that his enormous claw had been disintegrated in the blast. The heat of the fleshy plasma had cauterized his mangled stump instantly. Another legless torso crawled from the hole in the floor.
Ammo,
Big Dex thought.
they're using their bodies as ammo.
And if he didn't act soon, he'd be joining his bearded friend as a splatter on his son's bedroom wall. But the crazed, vibrating things were relentless. Worse, they didn't seem to give shit number one about their own lives. It was as though they enjoyed sacrificing themselves in droves if it meant the death of even a single monster. Big Dex couldn't let that happen. He had to find the children. Before the monster could move, another dozen humans swarmed around his legs, digging their claws and teeth into his scaly flesh, while still others clamped down around his feet at the floor, trying to hold him in place as the next bullet screwed itself into the man-machine. Seeing his daddy's hand melted off in the blink of an eye wiped the smile right off Dexy's face. He tried to scream, but Willix put her hand over his mouth.
Don't,
she whispered.
If they can do that to Dad, what do you think they'll do to us?
Dexy began to cry again. Big Dex roared. He kicked the humans clinging to his legs like ticks against the wall, smashing them dead, only to have even more fling themselves onto his body. He cracked skulls and bit clean through exoskeletons, but the droves of animalistic humans proved too much for him. The human bullet atop the flesh cannon spun, and the lights along its sides turned green as Big Dex was pulled to the floor by at least 15 naked, vibrating humans. As the bullet man spun and melted, Dexy broke free of Willix's grasp and screamed out, "Daddy!" just as the flesh cannon fired. Buckstack threw his bulk on top of the smaller monster to keep him from running directly into the bioblast. Big Dex's eye met with his son's just as the flesh bullet hit him, pulverizing the huge monster's body along with those of the humans, pinning him to the ground. The sound of the blast muffled Dexy's cry. The humans, those few remaining alive, shuffled back into the pit from whence they came. The flesh cannon disassembled itself, joining the others in the hole in the floor. After a moment, the bedroom was quiet once again. "Daddy!" Dexy screamed again. He pulled himself out from under the larger monster's body and ran to where his father lay. Big Dex was crumbled in a heap, his back to his son. When Dexy rolled him over, the little monster gasped and fell on his butt. Half his father's face, his entire arm, and most of his chest were just gone. Black, burnt flesh was all that remained. Big Dex's eye was open and unfocused, glazed over, lifeless. Then the hulking beast coughed and shuddered, his eye focused.
Dexy,
He slurred.
Daddy!
The little creature said, his voice hitching in his throat. He'd never had a reason to think his father anything but indestructible, a superhero. Seeing him prone and mangled was too much.
Come closer, Dexy.
The wounded monster pushed himself with some difficulty up onto his elbow and turned his body to face his son. Dexy did as instructed, his little eye darting to his father's wounds and then back to his face, as though ashamed to look at what the humans had done to his beloved parent.
I have to show you. Then you have to find your mother, Mom, and show her. Understand?
Show me what?
Big Dex's tongue split. The forked appendage snaked out. He took hold of it and jammed the end into Dexy's neck. Then, in that moment, the young monster knew that the humans had their eyes pinned open to keep them from shutting them in the face of the monster race's absolute horror. Knew that the factory which produced the gyroscopic modifications grafted to every human being on the planet lay deep, deep underground and spanned, impossibly, the entire length of the continent. And knew just how many scores of billions of humans were down there, building machine bodies and flesh weapons. Their only purpose, to eradicate the monsters from the face of the earth, or die trying. Dexy knew everything. When Willix and Buxtack finally chanced a glance around the corner of the rubble, Big Dex was dead. Dexy stood alone, his back to his fallen father. The little fly girl buzzed through the air while the lumbering Buxtack trailed behind her.
Is he?
Yes, Dexy said. A scowl adorned his features. He no longer looked like an innocent, scared child. He was calm, focused. He very much resembled his father in that moment, as though some part of the ages-old monster had transferred into his young son when he opened his mind to his boy.
He's dead. They killed him. And they're out there now, killing everyone else we've ever known, everyone we love, and they won't stop until they kill every last one of us or die trying.
Tears flowed down his sister's face, her little mandible parts, constantly moving like an ecosystem all their own, licked the liquid all away as she knelt over the body of her dead father. Buxtack put his big hands on her tiny shoulders.
I'm so sorry, Willix.
Dexy turned to face the other two young monsters.
We have to go. Mom needs to know what she's up against. She needs to know how many of these things there really are and what they plan to do.
Willix wiped her tears away, only for more to stream down her face.
How do you know what they plan to do?
Daddy showed me.
Buxtack stomped over to the window. Outside, the screams of dying monsters filled the air. As far as the big thing could see, humans slaughtered monsters.
If he couldn't fight them, what chance do we have out there? How do we even know where your mom is? We have to try. Dad thinks Mom and the rest of the night patrol will make their last stand at the base of the Overmind. That's where we're going.
Buxtack's right,
Willix said.
We're just kids.
If we go outside now, we won't last a minute. Any one of those things could kill us without effort.
You're right,
Dexy conceded. Buxtack rejoined the smaller creatures by their fallen father.
Best we hide and wait this out. If we wait this out,
Dexy said, turning his attention to the human corpses littered about the room.
there won't be a world for us left out there.
He studied each of them intently before moving on to the next.
But you're right about one thing.
He stopped above one of the humans. Its neck was bent sideways. Its eyes were vacant. When Dexy poked its exposed pupil, the thing let out a cry, but did not move. It was paralyzed from the neck down.
We do have to hide.
You're crazy, Willix said. She hovered over her little brother, all 6 arms crossed in protest. This will never work. You're going to get us killed, Dexy. The little monster was busy. He was using one of his sharp claws to carefully slice open the human's midsection at the stomach.
We're dead either way, sis.
The human looked down in horror, screaming gibberish as Dexy peeled back its belly, exposing its vital organs.
Shut him up, will you? If they hear him, they'll swarm back in here and we'll be done for.
Buxtack had been staring into the chasm in the middle of the bedroom floor. It was vast. The sounds of human screams and machinery echoed off the deep walls. He plodded over to Dexy and put one of his gigantic hands over the human's mouth, muffling his protests as the Cyclops monster extracted his stomach and most of his intestines, discarding them onto the floor.
Won't be needing these anymore, will you?
Dexy said, smirking. After Dexy pulled out several more handfuls of guts, the human stopped screaming. It was pale and sweaty. It continued to gibber, but did so quietly now. It would die soon. Dexy just hoped it would hold out long enough.
Oh, okay. Get him to his feet,
Dexy instructed. Taking the human by the shoulders, Buxtack lifted it up and held it in place. I don't understand, Willix said.
Watch, sis, and learn. This is going to be awesome.
Dexy rubbed his hands together and then crawled up into the human's flayed open stomach. Willix watched, disgusted but fascinated. Nothing happened for a few moments, and then, suddenly, the human's hand twitched. The thing looked down in horror as it flexed its fingers.
Oh, okay, now let go.
Dexy yelled from the human's guts, his voice muffled but excited. Buxtack released his grip on the thing's shoulders. It slumped and fell forward, but at the last second caught itself, steadied, and stood upright. It whipped back around to face the young monsters. This is awesome, the human said. Its speech was slurred and barely discernible. Blood oozed from its mouth and nose. Even though it smiled, its eyes were still filled with recognition and horror. It was not in control. Dexy was. Curled up inside the empty guts of the dying human, Dexy had fished his pronged tongue up to the point where the human's neck had broken and tapped into its spinal cord. He now operated the human's entire nervous system with his own mind. They now had the perfect cover.
I can't fit in there,
Buxtack said. Willix poked her head outside the human's stomach. Bits of intestine fell out and hit the bone floor with a soft splat. You could change your size, silly.
I've never done that before,
Buxtack said, all 10 of his eyeballs wide with fear atop the antler-like hands on his head.
My mom told me never to try that.
Why not? The fly girl asked.
I don't know. She never said why. She just said not to meddle with things I wasn't smart enough to understand.
Concentrate, Dexy said, speaking through the human's mouth. I know you can do it. Buxtack sighed. He closed his eyes, balled his hands into fists, and strained. Nothing happened. Try again, Dexy said. Buxtack stomped around in place, cleared his throat, and repeated. Again, nothing happened. Oh, brother, Willick said, this is a stupid idea. Buxtack hung his head in defeat.
Just leave me, guys. I'll stay here till the humans are gone. You don't need me anyway. I'm useless.
You're not useless, Dexy said, grinning madly. You're the key to my whole plan. The big monster looked confused.
Oh!
Don't worry about it. Look, I've got an idea, Dexy said. He steered the human body over to the mess of steel and flesh that had been people before Big Dex got a hold of them. He rooted around in the pile for several moments before extracting a loop of twisted metal. Perfect. Dexy wrapped the metal loop around Buxtack's hands. Now you're our prisoner. Buxtack smiled. He wanted to believe their plan would work, wanted to trust in his little buddy, but inside, he knew they were all doomed. Krug of the clan Krug was dying, but lucid. He had wished for a glorious death on the battlefield, like he was raised to believe he'd get when his people rose once again to the surface world that was ripped from their grasp by the evil things. He never imagined his guts would be infested with tiny evil, that he'd be held hostage in his own mind while evil masqueraded as the mighty Krug. If only he could reach up and push the button. The button would put an end to the tiny evil. Songs would be sung about his heroic death by the Krug clan forever if he could just take back his body from the tiny evil for 1 second. Push the button. Boom. Dexy and Buxtack crawled out the window. Blood streamed out of the foot-long wound in the human's stomach as Dexy marched it forward, swaying back and forth, still trying to learn how to walk with human legs. The monster city was in ruins. Acrid smoke billowed up from 1,000 scorch marks across its creeping flesh, choking the children, causing their eyes to water and their noses to sting. Neon blood from trench-like gashes turned the green river streets purple and black. All around the little monsters, screams of death, screams of agony and victory assaulted their senses. The Overmind loomed in the distance. Its all-seeing eyeballs still glowed blood red, a beacon of hope in a sea of apocalyptic chaos. How could it let this happen? How had it not known the human scourge still lurked below the surface? Dexy and Buxtack looked at each other and gulped. No sooner had they begun to trudge forward toward the Overmind when a warbling voice stopped them in their tracks. You there, stop! Dexy turned around to face a group of humans, 3 regulars and 6 pieces of a flesh cannon, including 2 bullets. They'd barely made it out of their house, and already they'd been spotted by an assault team. What is this monster which is not to be alive doing with you alive? The leader of the assault team asked. He was a short, stocky human with metal spikes protruding from his bald skull like porcupine quills. He is my prisoner, Dexy managed. The human's tongue was swelling from trauma and blood loss. Its body was going into shock, making its muscles rigid. The law states that we take no prisoners because of that which the law states, said another short human, this one female with rows of steel rings buried into the flesh of her large breasts. I know this one, a piece of the flesh cannon said, one of the bullets. It walked forward on its hands. He is Krug from the clan Krug, which I know as Krug from the clan Krug. What is wrong with your body, Krug? I was wounded by this one in battle with this one, Dexy said, trying to imitate the peculiar cadence of the human speech. He began to panic, and as he panicked, his focus wavered. The left hand of the human twitched, subtly at first, then in jerking spasms, trying to lift itself up. Dexy used the right hand to push it back down into place. It looks like glorious death will be upon you soon, who I know as Krug from the clan Krug. Why not take the tiny evil's head as a trophy to take with you to the great machine beyond, which is what awaits you after glorious death? Buxtack looked at Dexy terrified. What's happening? I can't see anything, Willix said, squirming inside the human's empty belly. Shut up, I can't concentrate when you're talking to me, Dexy said, losing more control of the human by the second. Okay, Dexy said. I'll just... Evil inside me. I'll just... Evil! Take this one back into the evil things house and kill him in there. No, the spike-headed human said, his eyes resting on the human's hand still jerking. Krug of the clan Krug will kill the tiny evil here because that is what we've told Krug to do. That's when the hand broke free of Dexy's grasp. It touched a series of spots on the spinning gyro embedded in its chest. The gyro stopped spinning and popped open, revealing a button within. The hand touched it, and the human exploded. For the second time in a day, Dexy woke up blind. He was sure this time was for real. He blinked and blinked, but all he could see was blackness. He couldn't move either. Maybe this was death. Didn't seem so glorious. Destroy the tiny evil. Nope, not dead, but blind and paralyzed? Might as well be dead. Then Buxtack climbed off him, not blind or paralyzed. But when he saw what was happening, he wished he was. The flesh cannon was forming itself, locking all the pieces in place while the bullet climbed atop the contraption. As if that wasn't bad enough, the ring-breasted human held Willix in her hand, holding her out triumphantly like a trophy. The spike-headed human lay dead on the ground. The blast from Krug of the clan Krug's body had sent shrapnel in all directions, impaling Spikehead in 4 or 5 different places, including his face, right between his eyes. Buxtack was unharmed. He charged the ring-breasted woman, tearing Willix from her grasp, tossing her back toward the spot where Dexy lay. Ring breasts sunk her metal claws into Buxtack's side as her remaining companion did the same. They dug their feet into the ground as the flesh cannon powered up. They were about to do to Buxtack what they'd done to Big Dex.
We have to help him, Willix,
Dexy said in a panic. We're just kids, she screamed back. We can't fight. Dexy grabbed his sister by the shoulders and looked her in the eyes. His face was his father's face in that instant.
You know what to do.
Dexy sprinted toward the humans as fast as his little legs could take him. He let out a roar that sounded more akin to a squeak and leapt into the air, landing on the back of ring breasts. He stuck out his tongue, letting it part, and jabbed the forked prong right into the top of her head, slicing through bone, piercing her brain. Instantly, the human went rigid and then let go of her death grip on Buxtack. She reached down and pried her companion, a skinny man with twin blades grafted to his forearms in place of actual hands, off the little monster as well, tossing him to the ground.
Now, Willix,
Dexy screamed with Ringbreast's voice. I can't, she stammered. What if I can't find myself again?
Mom does it all the time.
Well, I haven't done it ever, the little fly girl cried. There was no more time to argue. The first bullet man melted into the barrel, and the flesh cannon fired its shot. All three monsters were able to jump out of the way just in time, and the blast instead hit the outer wall of their house, turning it to mush, causing the structure to collapse before their eyes. Dexy, riding atop the ring-breasted human like a horse, and Buxtack climbed to their feet as the second bullet began to screw itself into place.
"Willix!"
Dexy screamed.
"We can't do it without you!"
"Okay," the fly girl said. She rose into the air above the dazed human with the blades on his forearms. He too climbed to his feet, screamed a warbled war cry, and charged Dexy and Buxtack, intent on keeping them away from the flesh cannon long enough for it to fire again. Willix took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and broke apart. Blade arms jumped into the air and struck out in a downward fashion, causing Dexy to pull Ringbreast's arms up in a defensive posture. The move deflected the blow, but not without severing her right arm at the elbow. She stared at the severed limb, now dangling by a single ligament, in disbelief, drool running from her mouth, unable to so much as scream out from the agonizing pain. Blade arms reared back to attack again when a fly buzzed in front of his face, distracting him. He waved at it annoyingly with a blade arm, but another took its place, then another, and another. Little flies buzzed all around the metal human's head until he was completely engulfed in insects. They didn't stop with his head. Soon, more and more flies swarmed around his arms, his chest, and finally his legs, until the human was completely concealed within a thick layer of buzzing, writhing little fly monsters. "Is this what you wanted?" the flies said in unison, a million little Willix voices speaking at once. Dexy smiled and roared again, but as he turned to lead the charge toward the flesh cannon, the bullet atop its multi-segmented barrel spun and melted down. The blast was aimed directly at the little monsters. There was no time to evade. Dexy shut his eye and prepared to be disintegrated where he stood, his only hope that his body, along with the ring-breasted human, would absorb enough of the impact to spare Willix's life. That's when Buxtack jumped in front of him and, without hesitation, grew to over 10 feet tall in the blink of an eye. The giant monster turned and braced himself as the blast met him right in the middle of his back. But a funny thing happened. Buxtack didn't disintegrate. His flesh didn't melt away. The superheated expulsion of liquid human bounced right off him and back toward the flesh cannon itself. The spray covered the bodies of the machine, burning their fleshy parts slowly. They howled in agony as the gunk burned through their skin, then muscle, through bone, until finally melting their lungs and vocal cords, putting an abrupt end to their protests. Dexy and Willix stared at Buxtack in disbelief. The big monster looked more surprised than anyone.
I'm not dead?"
he stammered out as he shrank back down to his normal size.
"No, big buddy, you're invincible,"
Dexy said, beaming with pride. "What do we do with the humans?" Willix asked, walking the blade-armed man around, swinging his blades through the air.
We'll kill them and then continue with our plan,"
Dexy said.
"This time, I won't mess it up."
Tapping the same series of spots Krug pressed in the gyroscopic circle at Ringbreast's chest, Dexy opened the secret compartment and tore out the self-destruct button, preventing another Krug episode. "Aw, man, I was just getting good at this. You get to do all the cool stuff," Willix said. Suddenly, Blade Arms started to shake. His screams penetrated the thick layer of flies swarming his body. Blood began gushing out from in between the little flies. Then, just as quickly as they'd swarmed him, all the flies darted off his body at once, leaving nothing more than clean white bones and metal exoskeleton in their wake. The flies had eaten him so quickly his bones still shook where they stood for a moment longer before collapsing to the ground in a heap.
Willix?
Dexy said, growing uneasy after she hadn't reformed into her real body after several minutes had gone by.
Sis, can you hear me?
Flies buzzed around, but there seemed to be no focus to their flight pattern. Dexy panicked.
Willix, you have to come back. You have to remember who you are.
Chill out, little bro, Willix said, reforming instantly behind him. She burped and rubbed her tummy. Remind me to eat humans more often. They're tasty. With Buxtack gaining control of his size, he was able to shrink down small enough so that all three monsters fit snugly inside the stomach of the ring-breasted human, after they'd extracted most of her innards, of course. They trudged along inside ring breasts for several miles. The vast devastation of their beautifully horrific city caused Willix to start crying again. Flesh cannons 10 times the size of those the children had encountered thus far boomed in the distance. Those machines must have required 100 or more men to construct the biomechanical weapons. Explosions rocked the sky, blasting their fellow monsters blessed with flight right out of the air. The death was nearly palpable, the scent of it, of mutilated corpses, both human and monster, created a dampness to the air they breathed. A silent dread grew stronger with every step they took, and still the Overmind's eye glowed strong as ever. A rumbling behind them caused the little monsters to stop. What this time? Some new death machine to delay their voyage further? Worse. It was the army. The fighting forces of humans were all converging together into one gigantic legion of millions and millions. And they all walked toward the Overmind. This was it. The humans would overtake the Overmind with the sheer vastness of their numbers, like an entire colony of ants overwhelming a bird or a lizard. The gargantuan army marched right past the monsters, paying the bleeding, ring-breasted woman with the huge gash in her stomach and less an arm no mind. The monsters fell in line and marched along with the humans. They were, after all, headed to the same place. Glory! Glory! Death! Death! The humans cried. Their chant aligned with their marching, one word for every step. Ahead of the little monsters, inside the body of ring breasts, was a sort of platform, except made of humans. They were all conjoined at the limbs and contorted in such a way as to make a walking stage, allowing the commander of this particular section of the human army to stand over his troops and survey their movement. The commander was twice the width of a normal human because it was two humans, grafted together at the face, shoulder, wrist, hip, and ankle, and all encased in an oversized exoskeleton. The commander was both a male and a female. Your fathers, the male head said, and your fathers' fathers of those fathers of which we speak of, the female head continued. They finished each other's sentences as though they shared the same brain. The way their heads were grafted together, maybe they did. Generations of brave people slaved away in the factories beneath our feet full of brave people. They died of burns and smoke and worse things that they died of, so that their sons and daughters would live to see this moment that is for their sons and daughters, so that the seed of their seed, the blood of their blood, could march upon the great evil and slay the great evil in which they came to slay. Rid this once beautiful planet of the cancer that's smothered this beautiful planet's lush, life-giving force for 500 years of smothering. Destroy evil! Destroy evil! The army chanted. Look upon the face of that which has a face upon which we look, the generals said in unison, as the army descended into the valley that lay at the foot of the Overmind. It stood taller than any mountain in the world, one glorious hunk of putrid flesh, the very worst, most awful thing ever to be dreamed up in the small, dark hours of the most imaginative human mind. The last time mankind looked upon its mighty visage, its mere presence had been enough to send them shrieking back the way they'd come, welcoming the teeth and claws and other horrors that awaited them, just so long as they never had to look at it again. But these were not those humans. These creatures had somehow escaped the Overmind's wrath and created their own hell. Generation after generation of tortured souls living and dying, but with one purpose: to look upon the face of the Overmind once again. Only this time, instead of shrieking madness, there were only howls of joy and chants of doom. The army stopped at the base of the Overmind. They were close enough to the titanic horror that tentacles darted out from the mountain of flesh and snatched several of those humans unfortunate enough to be stationed at the front of the line. They were dragged into slobbering, fanged mouths, violently dismembered and eaten for their troubles. Dexy, Willix, and Buxtack sat still inside ring breasts, doing their best human impression, trying to remain anonymous, knowing that a mistake like last time would mean certain death in front of this legion. Every single second that's passed since the great evil forced us down into the earth has led up to this second that is passing now, the general screamed. We take the mountain from the evil. We take the upper world back from the evil that is the mountain. Just then, a spot in the front of the mountain peeled back, revealing a dark chasm. A dozen monsters emerged, the children's mothers among them. They descended the mountain, standing defiantly at the base, directly in front of the legion of millions of mechanically enhanced humans. They were all that was left of the monster resistance. Suddenly, Willix burst from Ringbreast's stomach, zipping across the heads of the humans in the front line of the army before they could react. "Mama!" she cried. The little fly girl slammed into her mother, gripping the larger fly monster made of fly monsters so tightly she thought she might hug right through her mother's body. But something was wrong. "Mama," Willix said. Blood dripped from her mother's mouth. The little girl looked over at Buxtack's 9-headed Hydra-like mother. The eyes of her heads were lifeless. Blood oozed from their noses. "No," Willix said in a whisper. She jumped back just as metal hands ripped through the tops of the bodies of all dozen monsters. They tore the hollowed-out monster shells off like costumes, discarding their skins like so much garbage. The human masquerading as the little monster's mother stepped forward. Grafted to its head were 6 mini flesh cannons. "Victory is ours!" I have just come from the bowels of the great evil from which I have come. It spoke to me. It said, it is finished. We have won the thing in which we came to win. The ranks of millions of humans cheered. One huge, deafening, warbled yell filled the air and hung there for a moment. The humans had indeed won. The Overmind had conceded defeat, and every last living monster had been wiped off the planet. Except for 3 little kids. Unfortunately for the humans, one of those little kids was Buxtech, the destroyer of worlds, the scourge of nations. Buxtech, the invincible. Ringbreast's body erupted in a violent spray of flesh and metal as Buxtech grew. Tens of thousands of the closest humans to him were smashed in seconds as he continued to grow. The monster bellowed a low, mournful scream for his mother and grew larger still. Buxtech was now taller even than the Overmind. His eyeball-tipped fingers touched the clouds. He stomped backwards and squashed 10,000 more as the army below him began to scatter. But the monumental beast did not purposefully attack the humans. He cried and he screamed, but his eyes were glazed and unfocused. He stumbled away from the war below, aimless, grieving, mindless. Dexy wasn't blind when he woke up this time. Dizzy, sure, being knocked unconscious 3 times in one day was enough to rattle even the hardiest of monsters. And he was in trouble. He blinked the darkness away, only to find himself surrounded by humans. A lot of humans. Lucky for him, they were all paying attention to the hulking behemoth stomping away from them, each step like an earthquake, followed by thunder, when Buxtech screamed out for his mother. Dexy took the opportunity to scramble between the humans' legs. He found cover under the corpses of several newly squashed people. If they saw him, they'd rip him apart before he could finish what he'd come here for, what he'd seen inside his father's mind. He had to get to Willix, and fast, before Buxtech made it to the ocean. Willix broke apart again. It was hard to control the minds of millions of tiny fly monsters, but it was harder still to control her emotions. Every part of every one of those millions of tiny monsters wanted to see the gun-headed human dead. Willix imprinted all of her hatred and anger for the human race onto the being that killed her mother. She flung herself at the human, turning herself into a long, flying tendril, aiming for his stretched open grin. She planned to fly down his throat and turn him inside out, but he was fast. He dodged the attack, scooping up bits of monster and human gore off the ground as he did so, jamming the hunks of meat into the openings of the 6 guns on top of his head. When she turned in the air to strike for a second time, he fired all 6 shots in quick succession. His aim was good for 3 hits, blowing huge holes into Willix's flying tendril body, killing thousands of miniature versions of herself. While each death hurt, the little creatures bred just as quickly as they died, mating with each interlocking little fly version of herself, giving birth to 2 monsters to replace every one that died. Just as Gunhead reloaded his weapons with gore, the flying tendril dispersed, leaving only a small trail of fly monsters in its wake. I want 10 flesh cannons brought over here at once to the place that I am wanting flesh cannons. We can't let this one get away to a place which we do not know of. She's much more powerful than her size lets us know how powerful she is, understand? Gunhead glanced at the human to his left. I said, do you understand what I asked about understanding what I said? The human turned its head and looked at him. Its eyeballs had been replaced by flies. Dexy heard the screaming. He chanced a quick peek out from under his pile of corpses. He saw Willix 50 or so yards away, closer to the base of the mountain. She'd encased another human. She was battling with the one who'd come out of their mother's corpse. She had him pinned to the ground, using a swarm of fly bodies to slowly suffocate him. His legs jerked back and forth helplessly as his entire torso was covered in fly monsters. Dexy took the chance to scramble out of the corpse pile and take off running toward his sister. Most of the humans were forming flesh cannons and firing at Buxtack, who still stomped around in aimless circles. Most, not all. Dexy made it about 20 yards before a huge human with 2 additional arms grafted onto his hips stepped in his path. The little monster skidded to a halt. He gulped and put his hands out in surrender.
Now, wait a second. You don't really want to kill me, do you? I'm just a kid.
The human smiled even wider than his pinned-back cheeks forced him to. Narlac wants me to kill all evils, even tiny evils, which is what Narlac has been commanded to kill by his commanders. Before the 4-armed man could say more, a swarm of fly monsters attacked his head, completely enveloping it before scattering a moment later, leaving nothing but a clean skull to rattle around in its head cage. A second later, blood gushed up from its neck and the whole big human fell on its back. Willix reformed in front of her little brother. Why didn't you kill him? She asked, anger spewing from her voice. Her eyes were narrow slits. It's over, Dexy. We've lost. All we can do now is kill as many of them as we can before they overwhelm us. She touched her brother on the shoulder. It's what Mom and Dad would want us to do. Dexy smiled.
It's not over yet, sis. Fly me up to the top of Buxtack's head. I'll tell you everything.
A flesh bomb exploded directly in their path, causing Willix to almost drop her brother. Dexy cried out and redoubled his grip on his sister's waist. They flew at eye level with Buxtack, who was still hundreds of yards away. Dexy told himself not to look down, but did so anyway, causing him to cry out again. For a monster with 2 flyers in the family, he sure was scared of heights. Stop whining and tell me why we're doing this, Willix said, avoiding another explosion just off to their right. Dexy took a deep breath and closed his eye so he wouldn't have to see how high they were.
I saw inside Daddy's mind, into his memories. Big Buxtack. He didn't die in the war. Nothing the humans have in their power, then or now, could kill him. He was just too big. His brain doesn't grow with his body. Once he gets big enough, he forgets what he is and just walks. Big Bucks walked off into the ocean and drowned, sis. That's why Buxtack's mom never taught him how to shift sizes.
And what exactly are we going to do? Dexy grinned in spite of his fear of heights.
You'll see.
The general's 2 heads screamed in unison. They lived for war, had dreamed about this day their entire lives. The smell of evil blood on the air, even the honor of sending countless millions of their own kind to the great machine beyond gave them unbridled joy. This is it! We take down the giant! We wipe the globe clean of the evil which makes the globe not clean! The generals looked around at the teeming multitude of humans surrounding them. There were enough. Of course, there were enough. They would not make the mistakes of those weak, soft people who lived here before the evil. These humans were innumerable. They were legion. Dexy and Willix stood on top of Buckstack's head. Humans swarmed his body. Flesh bombs exploded all around him. It was useless. They hadn't so much as scratched his skin. That was the good news. The bad news was he was only 10 or 15 steps from the ocean. Dexy split his tongue and drove the prongs into Buckstack's skull, but they couldn't penetrate his hide any better than the human weapons.
I was afraid of that,
he said, putting his hands on his hips as Willix knocked a human who'd crawled up onto the giant's head back down onto his companions below, killing several more on impact. So, what now? Willix asked.
I don't know. But if we don't do it soon, our big buddy's gonna walk right into the water, and he can't swim.
I've got an idea, Willix said, snatching Dexy up, causing the little monster to scream and flail once again. The little fly girl zoomed straight up into the air, corkscrewed, and headed back down toward Buckstack's head, dodging a flailing human who jumped off the giant's hand antler in an attempt to knock the children out of the sky. Dexy continued to scream as Willix made a beeline for Buckstack's head. Dexy was sure they were going to hit the lumbering beast when, at the last second, Willix tossed her little brother into Buckstack's ear canal. "You're welcome!" she yelled as his screams faded the further he tumbled into the giant's head. Her celebration was cut short when she turned around and saw what loomed before her. How did something that big sneak up on her like that? The generals were face to face with Willix, all those hundreds of feet up in the air. The thing was breathtakingly enormous. 500,000 humans must have comprised the skeletal structure alone, all interlocked together, their metal hands and feet welded together forever. It was a mega centipede. Its body was miles long, arching backward in the middle and forward again way up here in the sky, forming a gigantic S. Row after row of flesh cannons, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, lined its underbelly like the legs of the bug it resembled, and fixed atop its head like a great horn were the generals. "Fire at the thing in which needs to be fired at!" they screamed. Willix couldn't dodge the incredible number of flesh cannons firing off at once. She had to break apart and skitter away as the explosions rocked Buckstack's titan body, causing him to stumble ever closer to the edge of the water. Something was wrong. Dexy should have taken control of the giant monster by now and steered him away from disaster. As more explosions knocked Buckstack onto the shoreline, Willix reformed and darted into the big beast's ear canal. She found her brother sitting cross-legged in front of Buckstack's little brain. His tongue prong was in place and his eye closed in concentration. His brow was creased, and the little scaly monster trembled. Willix put her hand on him. "Dexy, are you okay?" He opened his eye.
"It's not strong enough. Even with me controlling it, his little brain can't stop him from walking. The explosions outside, what is that?"
"The generals! They know they can't kill Buckstack. They're just pushing him into the water. They know everything, Dexy. They knew exactly how to wipe us off the planet."
"They've had 500 years to plan, sis. but they didn't plan on 3 little kids ruining their party.
Dexy turned and faced his sister.
We can beat the humans. Just do exactly what I tell you.
The abomination is the last of the evil that is the abomination,
the generals screamed from the top of the mega centipede.
The sea is its weakness. Push it into the unfathomable depths of that which is its weakness.
Buxtack was now ankle deep in the water. The mega centipede was right on top of him. The shoreline was completely obscured by human bodies. They waded into the water, singing songs of glory and death as they swam out to the mega centipede and climbed up its towering body, only to crawl into the barrels of the innumerable flesh cannons to be shot into the indestructible hide of the abomination. If every single human on the planet had to die to kill the last of the evil, that was just fine by them. Maybe the trees would sing the songs of their glory. More cannons exploded, driving Buxtack deeper into the ocean, now nearly up to his waist. The big thing was still crying and blubbering about its mother when the flies began pouring out of its ears. Willix replicated and replicated some more. Buxtack was shoulder deep in the water. Soon there would be no way to turn him back. He would drown where he stood, and then this war would really be over. No sooner would she replicate enough little versions of herself to cover the big monster's head than the mega centipede would fire off another 1,000-round volley of the flesh blasts, incinerating all of her work. This happened again and again, frustrating Willix to no end. She was about to give up. And then the cannons stopped firing. They'd come too far out into the ocean. The humans couldn't swim out this far. They were all drowning from exhaustion before they made it to the mega centipede. The generals screamed, their fury shaking the entire titanic creature.
Swim for your lives as though glory depended on your swimming.
This gave Willix just enough time to replicate herself over Buxtack's whole head, then his shoulders. Then she grew 3 sets of arms made of fly monsters from his long torso under the water. She concentrated. It was difficult sinking all the minds of all the billions of tiny flies covering the giant's body. If she lost focus, she would certainly never find herself among all of those little monsters again. And then it happened. Working together with Dexy, with much effort, they managed to turn the great beast around in the water. The generals unlocked their feet from the mega centipede's head. They climbed down its back, stepping on faces, backs, and elbows, ignoring the pained protests from the interlocking humans they stomped on. They stopped in front of a flesh cannon, reached down, and ripped one of the humans from the structure, tearing the helpless man's arms out of socket in the process, due to the fact that they were welded to the person above him.
For the glory of the death which brings me glory!
The armless man screamed as the generals stuffed him down the cannon's barrel, melting him down instantly, blasting his remains toward the abomination. The single shot did nothing to stop the towering beast, which now trudged back through the water toward the mechanical being.
We have come too far to lose after we've come so far,
the generals bellowed, scrambling back up to the mega centipede's head. No sooner had they locked themselves back into place than a gigantic fist covered in flies swung directly at their faces. The generals ducked, barely avoiding the blow. They locked their arms and finally their two heads permanently in place, allowing a series of nanobots to weld their bodies to the creature's frame. Their brains took full control of the giant centipede. Now they saw from the eyes of the millions of humans comprising the gargantuan machine, felt what they felt, heard what they heard. As soon as the two-person being finished orientating themselves with the mega beast's nervous system, the abomination's gigantic, fly-covered hand shot back out, grabbing the mega centipede around the throat. In response, the generals commanded their miles-long body to thrash up like a whip, smashing into the abomination's head, sending the titanic evil back another 100 yards closer to the abyss that awaited it below the waves. Flies covered the vast space inside Buckstack's head. They continued to multiply exponentially, now by the millions every minute. Soon they would cover Dexy as well. He panicked when the flies began to swarm over him. He tried to pull his tongue free of Buckstack's brain, but the prongs held fast, almost as though Buckstack wouldn't let him pull them out. "Don't fight it, Dexy!" millions of Willixes said as the flies filled the brain cavity entirely. "This is the only way! You know this! You wanted this!" Now flies crawled into his own head, massaged his own brain with the relaxing words of his sister. He no longer panicked, no longer cared about his own insignificant little life. He, Buckstack, Willix, they were all one creature now, one glorious monster known as, what had the humans called them? The Abomination. Their minds were perfectly in sync. They no longer thought as three separate entities. Their memories, their rage, their sadness melded together into one unstoppable giant. The mega centipede was wrapped around their face, trying to choke the life out of them. Impossible. The abomination took a step toward the shore, then another. That's when the centipede changed. Its segments shifted, creating two pairs of long legs while maintaining its noose-like tail. It more resembled a scorpion now. With these modifications, the human-machine hybrid was able to pull the abomination off balance and send both titans crashing underwater. Below the surface, the giant machine made of men changed again, splitting its long tail into two segments, each digging into the sediment of the ocean floor, pulling the fleshed beast further underwater as it permanently anchored itself beneath the waves. The abomination's fly carapace began to drown. Whole pieces of it broke off and floated back toward the surface. Air bubbles escaped its lungs as it fought to break free from the mechanical titan. But the generals and their millions of humans were not immune to the water either. Part of its vice-like legs began to drown and loosen their grip. The generals were close to unconsciousness themselves. Waves of panic swept through the machine giant.
"Glory comes to those who would drown to see the evil drown at the hands of those who would drown for glory."
The generals thought into the minds of each of the humans struggling to hold their breaths.
"Just hold on a little longer."
The abomination braced its arms against the sediment and arched its back, allowing it just enough space to smash down on top of the machine creature, killing thousands of drowning humans, causing it to loosen its grip that much more. More flies died and washed away as the three-minded monster swam in and out of consciousness. Another minute, and it would die as well. The generals spat out a lungful of stale air, then another. The abomination lashed out with its fists, tearing off segments of the machine in one last desperate attempt to break away. Air bubbles streamed from its mouth as it choked, still unable to swim to the surface. Then the machine creature spasmed. Its legs kicked uselessly in the water. The abomination held it fast, pinning it to the ocean floor. The two faces of the generals mouthed the word glory in unison and then went slack, the remaining air bubbles from their lungs trickling out of their mouths and noses. The generals were dead. The war was over. The monsters had won. Victory was short-lived as the abomination let out its final lungful of air in a vast stream of bubbles. In seconds, it would join the legion of humans in death. It was calm in that moment, ready to accept its encroaching demise, knowing it had wiped out the human race again, preventing them from taking back the world the monsters had won from them so long ago. Its final thought? Would there be glory in the afterlife for monsters? Or would the humans hog it all for themselves? That's when a gigantic arm reached into the water and pulled the titanic monster back to the surface. The abomination puked seawater on the beach. The few thousand humans left alive on shore ran for their lives, choosing to scuttle back under the rocks they'd crawled out from rather than face the glorious death they'd so recently sung about. Without their leader, they were as useless as a colony of bees without their queen. Already, the fly monsters were replicating, reforming across the surface of the abomination's flesh as it rolled over, breathing in huge lungfuls of air. After several minutes, it opened all 10 of its reptile eyes atop its hand antler head. What it saw made its breath hitch in its throat. Had it actually died down there, deep in the ocean? Was this heaven? The overmind? After 500 years of silence, it had chosen to stand up. Now it stood over the abomination, offering a hand to the fallen mega monster. The abomination took its hand and rose to its feet. It still had to look up to meet its savior's gaze. The Overmind's mountainous head loomed in the planet's lower atmosphere. Its huge glowing eye cast a red hue over the entire northern hemisphere. Its body was slender, its 6 arms long and lanky, each ending in a hand the size of city-states, its legs taut and muscular. The abomination looked up in awe, then fell to one knee. "Master," it said, shuddering in ecstasy at the sight of the most horrible of horrors, the creator of all monsters. "Rise," the Overmind said. Its voice shook the earth enough to cause tectonic plate shifts. Tsunamis roared across the surface of the ocean, washing away continents. The abomination did as instructed. "Walk with me." The two titans strode the Earth's surface, causing earthquakes and volcanoes to explode in tribute to the two godlike beings. The abomination looked into the Overmind's mountain face. "Why did you let them live, Master? Why let them slaughter our entire race?" 500 years ago, mankind blessed me with life. I, in turn,
created my own. But try as I might, I could not create a being as powerful as myself. I became lonely in my omnipotence. Even gods are limited by their own ego, I suppose. I was forced to be patient, to let the nature of this world, the nature of life, carry on at its own pace. I let the humans live so that my creations could breed, so that the humans could breed their hatred for me and my children. I hoped that when the time came, when nature pushed back, my children would be strong enough to survive, would be strong enough to do what I could not.
Create a god, the abomination said, finishing its master's thought.
And what a beautiful god you've created, my child.
The Overmind knelt down and kissed the abomination on its lips.
Come, let us leave this planet to fester and die. Its worth has run its course. We have more gods to create, worlds to conquer. Maybe the two of us can create a being powerful enough to worship ourselves. Wouldn't that be something?
With that, the Overmind opened at the chest, revealing a hollow cavern. The abomination stepped inside its master's body without hesitation. The Overmind grew wings made of trillions of little fly monsters and launched itself off the earth into the unknown blackness of space.